You may have heard about Lauren Southern's recent confrontation with social justice warriors in Vancouver. One of them soaked her with a bottle of urine. That's vulgar, disgusting, and a criminal act. But that's not what I want to talk about here. What I want to talk about here is what Lauren Southern was saying just before she was assaulted. She said, "Sorry guys, there's only two genders, female and male." It's clear to me that this is a controversial claim. But what is the nature of the disagreement here? How deep is it really? I think that there are three major points of contention here. The first is sex versus gender, a semantic disagreement about how and when to use these words and what these words really mean. The second is nature versus nurture, a contest between different causal explanations for the same observable human behavior. And the third is real versus fake. Who's real, who's faking, and who gets to decide? And ultimately, the reason that people care so much about these questions can partly be explained by reflecting on the importance of personal branding, identity, style, status, image, attention-seeking, marketing, and impression management in the context of the narcissistic age that we live in. Sex versus gender. According to my Merriam-Webster's 10th edition dictionary, the definition of gender is sex. So these words both have the same meaning. But there's a second definition as well. The behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. When Lauren used the word gender, she could have had in mind either of these two definitions. And normally it doesn't matter which definition you have in mind. If a questionnaire asks us to please indicate our sex or our gender, for most of us, our answer will be the same in either case. We'll either indicate M for male or F for female, and we won't need to think about our answer. It's extremely common to use the terms sex and gender interchangeably, even though they don't always mean the same thing. And this creates some confusion. If Lauren had said that there are only two sexes, male and female, then I doubt that anyone would have disagreed with her. So what is the difference between sex and gender? This distinction is relativistic and also somewhat murky. Sex refers to the more concrete, objective, natural, and biological category. And on the flip side, gender sometimes refers to sex, and other times it refers to the more abstract, subjective, artificial, and cultural category. But ultimately, gender does not come from nowhere. Gender is derived from sex and not the other way around. Nature versus nurture. Sex is more natural while gender is more cultural. Sex is more real while gender is more fake. Sex is more original while gender is more derivative. Here's an example to illustrate. Why should women have long hair and men short hair? This seems like an arbitrary fashion trend that has little if anything to do with biology. It doesn't seem to be a human universal, and it doesn't seem to have any practical purpose. Therefore, things like clothing, makeup, and hairstyle are great examples of cultural constructs that can fall under the category of gender. Things like hairstyle and clothing style also have a lot to do with beauty, status, identity, individuality, and group membership. It's easy to imagine a world where short hair is feminine because the women all have short hair, and where long hair is masculine because the men all have long hair. Menstruation, on the other hand, has a lot more to do with biology. It's a human universal, it does serve a practical purpose, and therefore, menstruation is a good example of a marker for which sex someone belongs to. We'll never live in a world where men menstruate and women don't. The only way to change that would be to change the meaning of the terms men and women. which, because they're words, and words are elements of culture, not biology, they belong to the category of gender and not sex. Are you confused yet? I think I am too, but please allow me to try to clarify. There is no clear line between sex and gender. These concepts are both tightly interrelated. But you can think of your sex as this general functional role that nature has given you, and also the general branding that nature has given you. Your gender, on the other hand, would be the general functional role that your culture, along with your nature, has given you, and also the general brand that your culture, along with your nature, has helped you to shape. A brand and a role that is also ultimately based on sex. Does that make it clear? Back to the argument, though. One side says that there are only two genders, and the other side says that there are more than two genders. So who's right? If you interpret these statements literally, then nobody's right. Because if gender can be socially constructed, then there is no right or wrong answer to how many genders there are. However, there is something very strange about the claim that there are, let's say, 5 genders. One thing that is certain is that gender is based on sex. Gender is derived from sex. Without sex, there could be no gender. And gender would quickly lose its meaning if it were not grounded in sex. It seems obvious to most people that gender reflects and corresponds to sex. Anyone who would deny this would seem very gullible indeed. And if we study sex in the natural world, we find a very consistent pattern that's impossible to miss. We find XX sex chromosomes and XY sex chromosomes. We find eggs and sperm. We find estrogen and testosterone. Take a good long look at this list of reproductive organs. People who have both male and female reproductive organs do exist, and people with ambiguous reproductive organs also exist. There's actually a continuum which exists between male and female. Not a spectrum exactly, but a continuum. Things are not as black and white as they often seem. As it turns out, males and females each have many of the same parts. And there are also gender-neutral terms for each of these parts. But you may have noticed a pattern here. Everything seems to come in pairs. They don't come in 3s or 4s or 5s. When we look at sex, what we find overall is basically a binary division into male or female, but with some degree of continuity and complexity. This is not just true of humans, it also extends to all mammals, birds, reptiles, and even plants. Even when both sexes occupy the same tree or the same flower, there are still 2 distinct sexes, not 3, not 4, not 5. And given that gender is derived from the 2 sexes, shouldn't gender be binary as well? Try the following thought experiment. Imagine that everyone in the world became transgendered tomorrow. What would that mean? If we define gender as a social construct, then that would mean that everyone would actually be cisgendered, because in this new world, everyone's gender would correspond to their biological sex. In this world, there would only be 2 genders. Now suppose that tomorrow, a randomly selected half of the population became transgendered, and the other half remained cisgendered. What would that mean? In that case, it would be impossible to tell which half of the population is transgendered and which half is cisgendered. But now, there would be no such thing as gender, because sex and gender would have absolutely no correlation. They would both be independent. They would have nothing to do with one another. Therefore, gender would cease to exist. In this world, you would have less than 2 genders, but not more than 2 genders. There are many ways to mix and match and alternate between and deviate from and rebel against the genders, but while this creates new styles, new identities, and new labels, it doesn't actually create new genders. But you have these people who like to come up with new gender identities, and they like to call these genders. And all you have to do is name your style, your personal brand, and it becomes a new gender. So as the number of distinct personal brands which are being called genders increases, these categories become less and less about gender and more about subculture and personal taste, because they're drifting away from their connection with sex, which is where gender derives its meaning from. The concept of freedom also enters into this argument. There's this idea that you should be able to choose a gender to identify as, and that the more choices of categories and labels and identities you have available to you, the more free you are to represent yourself or brand yourself as you see fit. Regardless of how free your choice really is, the idea is that each individual should have absolute authority on what gender they are. Real versus fake. We allow people to choose their own names, their own lifestyles, and their own careers. So why not allow people to choose their own gender? We don't allow people to determine their age, their professional designation, their credentials, or their species, just on their word alone. We require evidence. We have standards. We don't allow false advertising. We require detailed nutritional information, ingredients, and code dates on the labels of the food that we purchase, and we don't tolerate fraud. As I mentioned before, this has a lot to do with branding, impression management, marketing, attention seeking, style, image, status, and identity. We care about what other people think about us, and who and what they associate us with. That's no mystery. The only mystery is how we can apply the same logic to products like high fructose corn syrup. Coke and Pepsi are identical for all intents and purposes, but Coke is red, Pepsi is blue. Coke is the real thing, and Pepsi is not. Coke is the original, and Pepsi is a knockoff. What could be more different? What do you mean you can't taste the difference? That's insulting. But really, what does color have to do with cola anyways? And what does high fructose corn syrup and artificial flavors have to do with coca leaves and cola nuts? Gender is branding, as I said before. That's how I look at it anyways. Before corporations became interested in marketing and branding, nature became an expert at marketing and branding. Organisms have been manipulating one another ever since the dawn of time. Believe it or not, the reason that fruits look and taste good is because the plant, in a sense, actually knows what you want and wants you to become a regular customer. There are insects that try to look poisonous even though they're harmless. Animals will use camouflage to try to hide and blend in with their surroundings. And deception and fraud detection are both an important part of nature. Just like how companies develop ideas for how they want their products to be perceived and who they want to buy their products, people also develop ideas about how they want to be perceived and what sort of people they want to attract. But this happens on a subconscious level. People want to attract and seduce high-quality friends and potential mates. Women get breast implants and invest in expensive cosmetics. Men buy expensive cars that they can barely afford to create the illusion of status. The question here, and this is an open question, is what counts as false advertising and what counts as legit? Lauren Southern claimed to be an attack helicopter, just for the sake of argument. And what if she was 100% serious? Does that mean that she's lying? Does that mean that she's crazy? What happens when you give the people license to claim whatever they want to claim without requiring them to support their claims with some sort of relevant evidence? I feel like I'm an attack helicopter, therefore I am. Is that enough? Well, wait a minute. how exactly would you know what a helicopter feels like? And besides, you don't look anything like an attack helicopter, and why would anyone really want anyone else to think that they're an attack helicopter? The great thing about these thought experiments is that they force you to think, and if thinking about this sort of thing and asking these sorts of questions makes you uncomfortable, then thinking is not really your thing. Maybe you'd prefer to identify as a vegetable, or a sheep,